Hey everyone, welcome to Crank It Up Podcast, the YouTube home of Brigand Games. I'm Jim Price, and this is my third designer diary entry focusing on infinite loops and how we're trying to prevent them in Erudia Battle of Birthrights, our first game that's coming to Kickstarter in 2021. If you're not familiar with an infinite loop, it's a series of cards that you can play that will be a repeatable pattern that never ends. Thus, it either forces a stalemate because you're either stuck in a loop, or it can lead to an automatic win because you're doing something that has a positive conclusion over and over again, like accumulating infinite power or infinite VP. These are very bad things to happen, and we want to try to prevent them as much as possible. Now, I don't remotely claim to be an expert on infinite loops. I think to some extent they're always inevitable, and you have to work very hard to try and prevent them. We've actually seen an instance where we had one in playtesting, but we caught it fairly quickly because we actually went and avoided many of the rules that we've been talking about today. So, in looking at Friday's video, where I talk about 5 ingredients in Smash Up, you'll see a lot of patterns there, but basically, the idea is that for the type of game that it is, you're playing the same cards over and over again. And if you have the right combination of cards with certain abilities, playing those over and over again can lead to an infinite loop. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with playing a card multiple times. If an ability is great, you want to be able to play it multiple times because it leads to very good mechanics. And one of the other points I brought up is that by making a card appear twice, that actually makes it easier for things to infinite, especially if one ends up taking the place of another. There's nothing inherently wrong with making a cool ability appear twice. Again, it's all about what is the total effect of what's happening. And when you think about the idea of playing cards over and over again, and the fact that that could lead to an infinite loop, I started to wonder several years ago, why doesn't this happen in other games? What controls are they putting in place to prevent that? Are they preventing certain types of abilities or not? And I think about a game like Dominion, which is one of my favorite games still. It also has, to an extent, an action point allowance system, but you only have one action. And the idea is that several of the cards grant additional actions. I think about a card like Laboratory. And this is important because one of the points that I made in Friday's video was that the smaller your deck gets, the more repeatable something becomes, especially when recursion is involved, because you can keep recycling the same cards and playing them, and recycling and getting the same cards becomes more likely the smaller your deck gets. Well, in a deck building game like Dominion, the decks are inherently small, and therefore they would be more likely to have this problem. So Laboratory is a card that gives you 2 cards and an action. So all these laboratories can chain into each other, and they can just keep playing. Well, if their cards went to the discard pile, then you'd have that problem, because a laboratory would draw 2 cards, let you play a replacement, which could be a laboratory, and if you had enough card draw, then you would just repeatedly do the same thing over again. You wouldn't really be accomplishing anything in that particular instance, but at least you'd be looping infinitely. There are other cards that draw their own replacements as cantrips that would actually provide a benefit for being an infinite loop, like a Grand Market, where you're constantly drawing and replaying cards, but what you're doing is you're also gaining additional gold and additional buys, and therefore you could start buying everything, and you could instantly win the game like that. That would be very bad. But why doesn't that happen in Dominion? Well, the simple answer is that cards don't actually go to the discard pile yet. There are several types of deck playing games. So a deck building game is something like Dominion or Hero Realms, where you start with a small deck and you're adding to it over time. A deck playing game would be something like Smash Up or Guardians or Sentinels of the Multiverse, where the deck is pre-constructed at the start of the game and you're simply playing it as it unfolds. Magic the Gathering also being a deck building game, but I'm not an expert on Magic, so I can't speak to that. And in many of these deck playing games, it's natural for a card to go to the discard pile after it's been played. But that again creates the same problem where if the card goes to the discard pile, it technically is eligible to be played again, and if you have something that generates a lot of extra plays, well then that's going to potentially be a problem. In a game like Sentinels that has a 40-card deck per hero, that's not going to be realistic. I don't know of any infinite loops in Sentinels. So their cards can go to the discard pile no problem, and because not every card does that, even if you could actually play another card after you play a card, there's a Tachyon card, I think it's Fleet of Foot, that lets you draw a card and play another card. Even if you had a number of those, they're far outweighed by everything else in your deck, so that you couldn't possibly infinite loop. But we want those types of abilities where you could actually chain plays into each other. So the easy answer is to take the discard pile out of the equation and don't let your cards go there. Well, that brings up another question. Where do they actually go in the meantime? When you think about a game like Dominion, you're playing cards into a sort of a tableau, and then during your cleanup step, because it's action by cleanup, during your cleanup, you're actually pulling all your cards down, and that's when they're getting discarded. And that's a concept that works really well for these types of games if you want to prevent infinite loops. In a way, it sort of functions like a cooldown. And we call this limbo in Erudia, referring to the in-between state where cards may be able to go. At its core, there are two main types of cards. Cards that stay in play permanently and cards that don't. Cards that stay in play permanently would be things like units, constructs, attachments. Specifically, they are designed to be brought into play and to stay into play until they're removed. But then there are cards that do the opposite, actions or items. Like if I'm going to do something the equivalent of a one-shot in Sentinels of the Multiverse, it's just going to do its thing and then leave. That would not be staying in play. But where does it go? We could put it in the discard pile, but that creates the infinite loop potential. But we could put it into limbo instead, where it will stay until the end of your turn, and as part of your cleanup, you'll pull everything down. That started as a way to prevent infinite loops, but it actually ended up becoming so much more than that, and that's what I want to talk about in this video, how you can start with something that feels like a defensive mechanism, but it actually turns out to be central to the organization of the game because it does a lot of interesting things. The first thing that it does is it actually organizes your turns better and makes you think about turn to turn. I mentioned that it's sort of a cooldown timer. The game that comes to mind is Mass Effect if you play video games. I love being an adept, specifically in the first game, because I had all these abilities and I could just fire them off and they each have their own cooldown timer, so I couldn't just keep spanning my bionics. But what a cooldown timer does is it means that you can't abuse something. You're using it at a regular cadence, and you can define what that cadence is going to be. Maybe some are longer than others. In the context of Erudia, the cadence ends up being a single turn. Why it's important is because you need to consider how are we getting those cards back so that I could be playing them again, recursion being very powerful. A great example of this is the Battlefield Crystal Caverns, which has a loot ability that says that the winner can get back any number of items from their discard into their hand. Items are very powerful, you can use them for great effects, and you can get them back. But items also go into limbo. What that means is that it's very hard to actually use an item that turn in order to break Crystal Caverns and have that be one of the items that is actually eligible to be returned by Crystal Caverns. And so I have to think a turn before, this is a great ability, I want to win that battlefield for its ability, but I need the items to be in my discard pile. So I have to play them earlier, hoping that they're going to be in my discard pile at the time that I win. And it creates a lot of intrigue given that the fact that a cave is set on a timer. A cave will collapse and it will be captured within a certain amount of turns. In Crystal Caverns' case, it's actually 9. So by the 9th turn, I need to have as many items as I want in my discard pile if I'm trying to win. But since I'm targeting that battlefield and items are helping me do it, it means that I'm adding more presence onto there, which can be considered power creep, meaning that it's going to be easier for my opponent to use that power against me and actually steal it. So if I'm using an item like the Isodose to try and deploy a unit so that I can get the Isodose back, I'm actually committing more resources to the battlefield and making it easier for my rival to collapse on their turn. And there's a lot of urgency because of the timer, so I can't necessarily wait. I really like the fact that it creates that turn-to-turn planning and the fact that you have to play several moves in advance because you can't play something and recur it on the same turn. I would think that most players can play the hand that they are dealt. Given a certain set of cards and given a game state, they can figure out what is the best move to do in this situation for the short-term goal. But Erudia is never meant to be a game about short-term goals. It's meant to be much more strategic and long-term planning, and that's what separates, the newer players from the experienced players, players who can see, all right, this is part of a progression of moves with an ultimate endgame, and that way you feel like you're really planning out your deck. You're not playing your hand, you're playing your deck potential, and going from turn to turn, it makes you a lot more involved and it gives you a lot more to think about, which is something that I really enjoy about the game. The second thing that Limbo does is it allows an ability to interact with the cards in Limbo. A great example of this would be water on acid. The chemists have several ingredients they can put into Limbo because items go into Limbo unless they're equipment. Water on acid is a way of, Limbo becomes a way of tracking the ingredients that are in Limbo, and water on acid can then make use of it for new and powerful effects. It's a way of saying that I have got this card that's going to combine abilities that I've already played this turn and use them in exciting ways. And we have many examples of this, of cards that can actually interact with Limbo or benefit from the presence of cards being in Limbo. But even more than that is the ability to have Limbo act as sort of an internal timer for cards that actually go beyond turn to turn. So the first benefit was that it helps organize your turns, from turn 1 to turn 2. It also gives you a clarification as to what you've actually played in an individual turn, but it also says that I have this effect that I want to take place several turns in the future, and I want to do some really cool abilities with that. And that's my favorite aspect of Limbo. It's something that is going to get heavily used in the future. One of the advantages of knowing how the game is going to advance in terms of the classes is that we can know what types of interesting abilities will come, and we can refine the Limbo rules in order to reflect the potential for those abilities so that the Limbo rules don't have to change over time. A great example of this right now is the Vape Lance, which is a skeleton weapon that can be played multiple times over the course of the game. It gives you +2 permanent power, and instead of going to the discard, it's actually going to go into Limbo, which is going to hang out for a couple of turns. Eventually, that card is going to come back. It's cursed in a sense that it never actually leaves play. And as long as you have an eligible unit to grab it, you're going to be able to get that power over and over again. It can go into Limbo, get pulled back, go back into Limbo, and you can play it multiple times. One of my favorite games was when Eric actually did this to me, and he timed it perfectly. He played the Vape Lance about 3 or 4 times over the course of the game. Every single time, he had set it up so that way the Lance would come back, he'd break a battlefield with the exact amount of power, the Vape Lance being the difference maker in that, and he'd send it back into Limbo. And the only thing I can do about it is to try and keep his units off the field so that it doesn't have a valid target, because if it has no one to go to, it's going to get discarded. It's set in advance. I can see it coming as the rival. I could plan around it, but so can he. And it's super interesting because it means that, turns are no longer in isolation. Again, you're planning out from turn to turns. You're saying, all right, if there's 3 turns that I have with the Lance, I want to make sure that there is another unit that is left on the field so that I can grab my weapon and keep the cycle going. Again, you're not just playing your current hand, you're thinking, how is this going to go over a long period of time? Another example of this is the Holy card from the Clerics. Now, unfortunately, the art for that is not done, so I can't show you a preview, but the Holy is an example of a long-running spell. If you think about Final Fantasy Tactics, which I've mentioned being a big inspiration for this game, Final Fantasy Tactics has a long-running spell. You may start the spell early on, but it's not going to fire for a while. Well, how would you track that? How would you allow things to progress from turn to turn? Limbo is the answer. And Holy is an example of that, and we have plenty of cards that are coming that would do something similar, where you start the spell, it may have a small effect, but it's going to build over time, and then it's going to fire. Now, if I made that an attachment or a construct or an equipment, that could potentially be dealt with, and that's not going to fire. I really like the idea, specifically in RPGs, of that the boss is announcing a big attack that's coming in future turns. Like Odin used to do this countdown where he'd give you a number and it's like in 5, and in 5 increments, 5 intervals, maybe it's 5 turns of the boss or 5 minutes, a super powerful attack is coming and you need to defend against it. You can't necessarily counter it, but you can defend against it. And that's what Limbo allows us to do, to cast a powerful spell like Holy that has a pretty interesting way of avoiding its effect and it gives your rival a certain amount of time to prevent it, and it gives the player a certain amount of time to ensure it. It's a very interesting back and forth mechanism, one that's made possible by giving a space for cards to not go to the discard pile, and it's why Limbo is such an integral part of this game. It's funny that it started out as an imprudent loop prevention and for cooldown, but it ends up being part of the design space, and when you do that early on, you can do some really interesting things with it, and I hope that you will get excited about it once you get used to it. I will admit, if you played similar games, it will take some getting used to, but I think you'll find that it's a fascinating design space and one that allows a number of interesting abilities. So that's it for today's Designer Diary. I hope that you enjoy it. We'll see you next week, but for now, let's shut it down.